There was man, and man named the flowers flowers, the mountains mountains, water water, and trees, and named birds, and horses, and elephants. And then there was a couple, and together they could say, together. They ate from the tree of life, and they ate from the tree of wisdom, and that made them paranoid, and so they put on clothes, and they felt that they needed to build spears, and they used fire and agriculture. Because they hadn't navigated the world and they didn't know the way that the world was shaped. So they called their home Olympus, and they said it was in the garden called Eden. And they mapped the garden, and they said that it had 4 corners, and each corner they gave a name: Atlantis, Europe, Asia, and Egypt. And also because they were inventive and imaginative, they thought that they all lived at the top of mountains. And technically true. They thought that the world had been flooded and that they lived at the top of mountains. And they said that the land beyond where the north winds blew, it was shining all the time with the sun, and they had different names for that area. And they knew that far in the north it was very cold, and they called the entire world Aden. Because the cultures were separated from each other, they developed different ways of communicating and different ways of moving around, and of traveling and trading and interacting with each other. This led to the development of different mythologies, although they all accepted that they were connected, and they gave each other the names from their own mythologies to add to each other's mythologies, and that way they were able to record each other's mythologies, although still using their own individual mythology names. And it gets a little bit complicated for those trying to read it far in the future. The Greeks were seafarers, and they sailed on boats, and they would often stop at different landmarks, and they would say that the rivers were guided by nymph spirits, and different areas had different gods and spirits guiding and guarding those areas. And they called mountains titans, and they gave names to the sun and the moon and to the clouds. And often they would stop at a certain river, and they would leave a shrine and give thanks for having fresh water, or they would stop and build a small shrine next to a certain place that gave them food. And they would also stop near the mountains and give thanks for not turning into volcanoes and throwing boulders at them and making them afraid. And after a long time, these spirits and temples were used to navigate and help them navigate around the Mediterranean. And it's very useful for people that are studying ancient manuscripts, because the Greeks often talk and describe the different landmarks using their spirits and guides and gods. But it also developed into the mythology, because the small shrines of thanks would, beginning from superstitions, eventually would turn into a full religion. So as an example, the horizon they called Theia, and they said that the horizon gave birth to the sun and to the moon, and they named those Helios and Selene. And they said that the sun gave birth to Apollo, so Helios was the father of Apollo, and Apollo was the spirit of the light. And they would leave shrines to Apollo because they were thankful for the sunlight, and they would leave shrines to Persephone, and Persephone was the spiritual embodiment of the springtime, and that's why they would often say that Persephone was taken into the underworld for the winter seasons, because that's how they explained their process of germination in plants. And so it's just a basic way of how the Greeks would navigate around the Mediterranean and how they describe the world around them. The Egyptians, though, they were a very different culture because they never traveled around the Mediterranean trading, because they had all the things that they needed. They were provided all the stuff and the agriculture that they needed to exist from the River Nile. And so they were very dependent on the river's flows and on the sunlight. And because of that, they gave thanks to the sun, they gave thanks to the river, and they left giant landmarks because they believed in rebirth. They believed in rebirth, and so they built giant tombs, and it's often been confused by modern historians as being a tomb left by the pharaohs for an afterlife in the spiritual world, but the pharaohs often believed in rebirth, and so it was also good for the general populace, because the populace believed in rebirth as well, and that meant that they were happy because they believed that if they helped reward the pharaohs, then the pharaohs would reward them by giving them spaces in their tombs, and then they would all be rebirthed at the same time. And so that way the people were happy, and they were happy to help construct enormous landmarks. It was supposed to be to defend them all whilst they slept in death, awaiting the rebirth in the future. So they believed that they would live and die, and then they would stay dead for a while, and then they would be rebirthed in the future. And that belief is the belief that the Egyptians had, because they genuinely thought in the future that they would be rebirthed. We don't know if they thought that this would be done through magic or through science, but we know that they were clever enough to build the monuments, and that they had basic mathematics and also advanced mathematics, and also a very basic form of writing. And the Egyptians were also very respectful to the animals around them, especially the animals that they thought were very intelligent, like cats. And they thought cats were very intelligent because cats can tell the time even though they don't have clocks. Anyone that feeds a cat will know that to be true. Unfortunately for the Egyptians, they were conquered by the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans, and then the Arabs, and then the Europeans. And most of their temples were robbed, and all the things that they expected to have with them when they were rebirthed have been stolen. We don't know much about the Atlanteans. We know that they fished with dolphins, and that they had advanced sailboats techniques and advanced metallurgy. So they were quite developed as a technical people. Technologically, they were quite developed, but their water was all their water was swallowed by the Atlantic, and most of their men were swallowed by the deserts, and that's the records. That's nearly all the records we have of them. In Europe, they had big rainforests, and the people lived there peacefully. And the climates were much harsher than in the Mediterranean, so they lived in the forests peacefully with the animals. And we know that they wore circlets, and the druids had very long hair, and most of the men had very long hair as well. And they had basic runes that they would carve onto large boulders, and they were the most important stories that they felt needed to be remembered. Although they also left a lot of runes on the trees as well, and there was a lot of trade amongst the different woodlands and the peoples, so they weren't completely disengaged from the rest of civilizations. We know that they had wolves that they tamed and made pets, and so they had a lot of uh, experience with husbandry and animals. But they lost all of their folklore after the Romans invaded. So the four lands existed in peace for a long time. The Atlanteans were forced to move away because their habitats changed. Most of their water fell into the ocean, and everything that remained turned into the desert. The civilizations remained peaceful for a long time, but there was a big cataclysm in the east, and there are a lot of records of the volcano exploding. We're not exactly sure where it was, but what we do know is that it created an enormous cloud of ash that covered all the skies and made all the people very afraid. And it destroyed the crops because the crops stopped growing and the animals all died and the fish in the waters were poisoned. And because the Greeks relied the most heavily on fishing, they then went and asked the Asians and the Egyptians for help to help feed each other. And we know from records that the Egyptians and the Asians helped to feed the Greeks, but it wasn't enough food because their crops failed as well. And so all the lands were thrown into disarray, and there were many, many raids by the Greeks against the Egyptians and the Asians when the Greeks were raiding for food. And because of that lawlessness, the Egyptians asked the Nubians to send help, but the Nubians realized that the Egyptians were weak and began to attack the Egyptians. And so the Egyptians were being attacked by the Nubians and also by the Greeks. And the Asians, we know that their systems collapsed and all their kingdoms collapsed, and there was a lot of anarchy in those lands. And so the Egyptians were struggling, trying to protect themselves from all the lawlessness. And we know that the fortress cities and the towns with castles high up on the mountains were protected. And there's a lot of records from this, from all the different cultures, even in the book where Isaiah is talking about different raiding groups from different civilizations. So all the cultures in the area recorded it at some time. The ash cloud eventually moved away far to the east of the Mediterranean, and in that land the Persians benefited from all the ash that fell and made their crops very, very enriched, and they had a bountiful crop for a few seasons. And that also gave them the opportunity to invade the weakened West. And after 3 generations, the Persians had conquered the Egypt and all of the Asians and the Levant, and they had conquered some of the Greek city-states. And the Athenians created a large fleet with the Spartans and the other Greek cities, and they repelled the Persian conquest of Europe. Eventually the Greeks would create an alliance under Alexander the Great, and they would reconquer Asia and Egypt and also the Persian cities, and would march all the way into India, where they would conquer many of the North Indian states. And that's why Alexander the Great is often seen as the greatest conqueror, because he conquered the Persian Empire. Alexander's legacy would go on to create the Roman Empire. That's another story altogether.